They'd called it overkill. While most men were patching gaps with moss and stacking bark over leaky corners, Elijah Braddock was hauling whole logs onto his roof, notched, interlocked, and pinned with handmade pegs. The others scoffed, called him paranoid, said no snow ever fell hard enough to crush a proper cabin. Not in these parts. Not since the spring of '47, at least. But Elijah wasn't building for last winter. He was building for the one he knew was coming. The old man didn't talk much, but when he did, it came like a slow knife, steady, deliberate. He'd survived more winters than most of the valley had seen birthdays. Some said he'd been trapping up here before the war. Nobody was sure which one, maybe both. All they knew was that Elijah Braddock didn't just endure the high country, he outlasted it. And that winter, the sky was whispering early. By October, squirrels were nesting deeper than usual. The deer had vanished from the east ridges. Creek ice formed before All Hallows Eve. Elijah saw it all. He didn't say much, just started reinforcing his cabin. The others laughed. His cabin sat on the northern edge of the valley, tucked near a line of wind-carved spruce. Not the easiest place to fetch water, not the sunniest either, but it was the highest, and the most exposed. When the wind came howling through, it hit Elijah's place first, like it was trying to knock on his door with frozen fists. Most cabins had sod roofs, a few logs cross-laid with sticks and dirt. Elijah's roof? Double-beamed, weight-distributed, and sloped at an angle he claimed matched the mountain's fall line, so the snow would slide rather than stack. "You building a church?" one of the miners had joked. "No," Elijah had said. "I'm building a coffin I can climb out of. That shut them up for a week." He lined the ceiling with bark stripped from ironwood, sealed with pine tar, and chinked the seams with a mix of clay and horsehair. Every beam was matched in diameter. Every notch was seated flush, no gaps, no weak points, no rot. He worked slow, deliberate, even as frost crept into his beard before noon. By December, most of the valley had gone still. Fires burned low, men drank longer, hunted less. The creek froze over solid. Even the birds fell silent. Elijah just kept stacking logs. By the time the blizzard came, most cabins were still unfinished. Chimneys leaned like drunks, roofs groaned, doors jammed in warped frames. Nobody remembered the warning signs, nobody but Elijah. And by the time the sky turned black and the snow began to fall sideways, only one cabin was ready to be buried. And only one man had built for that. It started on a Thursday. Thick flakes, at first lazy and slow, like a curtain dropping across the ridgeline. By sundown, the curtain had turned to a wall. Men leaned out their doors, squinting into the whiteness like it might back down if stared at hard enough. But Elijah didn't look. He just latched the door from the inside and checked the pressure in his roof timbers one last time. The others called it just a good snow. That was before the wind came. By morning, the storm had teeth. It howled across the valley, like it was searching for something, some weakness, some open door. Canvas tents snapped loose from their moorings. Chimneys vanished under drifts. The snow piled so fast it buried firewood stacks by mid-morning. By noon, one of the newer cabins built quick in October by a trio of hopeful trappers lost its entire back wall. Nobody knew if the men inside had survived. Nobody could reach them. Visibility dropped to nothing. Voices couldn't carry more than a few feet. It was the kind of storm that separated your mind from your body, if you weren't careful. Men crawled between cabins with rope tied to their waists, and even then, some never made it. But Elijah's cabin stood still. The wind hit it first, just as he'd planned, slammed into the slope of the roof, and rolled upward, sliding off like water on stone. Snow built up along the backside, sure, but that was by design. Insulation, pressure, weight spread evenly across the bones of the house like a second skin. Inside, it was quiet. He moved slow, conserving energy. Lit the fire just twice a day. The clay-packed chimney carried smoke clean and low, no draft, no collapse. He melted snow in a blackened pot, rationed dry meat and winter biscuits, and breathed through a reed vent he'd built into the ceiling. Not luxury, but life. He scratched one mark into the beam by the door. Day 1. He didn't expect to come out for at least 10. Around midnight, the storm shifted. It roared harder now, like it had gotten frustrated. Elijah could feel it pressed down on the roof, hunting for a crack. The logs moaned faintly only once. Then silence again. That was the moment he knew most of the valley wouldn't last. The next morning, nothing moved outside. No footprints, no smoke from any chimney but his. He stepped back from the door, rubbed his beard, and muttered aloud to no one. They built for yesterday. He lit his pipe and sat near the wall, listening to the blizzard try to swallow a world not meant to last. He didn't pity the others. He didn't curse them either. He just listened, because that's what a man does when he's the last one above snow. By the third day, Elijah couldn't open his door. Not because it was frozen shut, he'd expected that, but because there was no door anymore. Just snow, packed tight and hard against the threshold, 3 feet higher than the lintel. He tested it gently with his shoulder and felt the truth of it. The world outside had been erased. He didn't panic. Instead, he lit his lamp and sat cross-legged near the floor vent. Air still flowed. The smoke from his pipe curled upward and drifted into the dark. That meant the chimney was open. That meant he had time. And in a storm like this, time was everything. He moved methodically, shaved off slices of salt pork, melted snow, and stirred in crushed spruce needles to keep his strength up. Checked every seam in the cabin, each corner, each roof joint, each beam. The logs groaned, yes, but they held. Tighter now, compressed under weight, like a lung mid-inhale, braced, tense, unyielding. That tension? That was safety. Other cabins hadn't braced properly. He knew it, could feel it. The way the wind seemed to weep in the distance, not just howl, but cry. Somewhere out there, men were digging frantically. Others, maybe, were sitting in the dark, hoping their roofs would hold another hour. Some were already under, but not Elijah. His cabin had been buried before. The blizzard of '49 covered the east wall so high he had to tunnel out through the chimney. That storm only lasted 4 days. This one was worse. This one had anger. And this time, Elijah was older. He moved slower now, careful not to sweat. Heat was dangerous. It melted the snow around you, created slush, collapse, weakness. Better to be cold and controlled than warm and dead. He took out the draw knife and scraped the frost from the inside beams. Checked his breath against the clay seals. If the roof gave way, it would happen in a moment, not loud, not violent. Just a slow sigh, then a crush. But it hadn't, not yet. He etched a second mark on the beam by the hearth, day 3. Then he did something he hadn't done since the storm began. He smiled. Not because he was safe, not because he felt victorious, but because the blizzard had done its worst, and still his roof hadn't cracked, his walls hadn't shifted, his plan had worked. He wasn't surviving by accident, he was surviving on purpose. And in a winter that took every man who guessed wrong, Elijah Braddock had guessed right. He leaned back against the wall, let the snow press in, let the cold circle like a wolf without teeth, and he waited. On the 4th day, the blizzard slowed but didn't stop. It became heavier, thicker, as if the sky had given up rage and turned to mourning. Snow no longer fell with speed. It simply accumulated, quiet and deliberate, blanketing every flaw until the valley looked soft and innocent again. But beneath that stillness was ruin. Elijah knew it the moment the silence changed. The wind wasn't screaming anymore. But neither was the forest. The trees had stopped groaning, no branches cracked, no weight shifted. It was the kind of silence only found after something breaks. He lit a pine chip, walked to the western wall, and pressed his ear against the logs. Still, no sound from the outside. The snow was too thick. But he felt it in his gut, the ache of a storm that had finished its killing. Now it was just covering the bodies. He'd built a viewing slit near the roof, barely a hand wide, protected by overlapping planks and sealed with waxed rawhide. It wasn't meant to open unless absolutely necessary, but this felt necessary. He carved away the seal and worked the cover loose, slow and patient, until a shaft of light pushed through, muted, gray, and oddly warm. He leaned in. What he saw made him exhale, long and bitter. The valley was flattened. Cabins he'd watched go up in October were gone now. Roofs pancaked into the drifts, walls pushed outward like broken ribs. A few chimneys stuck out at odd angles, crooked fingers clawing toward a sky that no longer cared. There were no footprints, no smoke, no movement, just mounds. So many mounds. He counted 12 in his view. 12 cabins, 12 chances that someone had ignored the warnings, rushed the build, skipped the crossbeams, or left the roof flat. He closed the viewing slit and resealed it, sat back down at his table, made of pine slabs bolted into the wall, took out the tin of coffee grounds he kept for moments like this, measured out a thimble's worth, boiled snow, drank it slow, one sip, then another. He hadn't come to the valley to be a prophet. He hadn't built his cabin to prove a point. But now that the snow had spoken, the silence itself felt like judgment. Some of those men had families, others had dreams. All had scoffed at the warnings, said Elijah was building for the end of the world. And maybe he was. He carved the 4th mark into the beam, paused, then carved a short line beneath it, not a notch, just a sign. One for each life he thought might be gone. He didn't cry, but his hands were slower after that. Even the fire burned quieter. It wasn't the cold that woke him, it was the absence of crackle. Elijah opened his eyes to silence so complete it sounded thick. The hearth was dark, just a bed of ashen dust where coals should have glowed. He rolled over, groaned, and rubbed his face with his hands. The cabin didn't feel cold yet, not fully. The logs still radiated leftover warmth, like bones after a fever. But he knew what was coming. The fire had gone out sometime around midday, he guessed by the light, slanting weakly through the chinked gaps near the rafters. That meant the temperature inside had already dropped by half. He had about 3 hours before the freeze claimed the air, and 6 before it started creeping into his core. He didn't panic. Instead, he stood slow, wrapped the deerskin shawl tighter around his shoulders, and walked barefoot across the pine needle floor. Every step made his joints complain. The cold was finding the old breaks in his ankle and shoulder again, the ones he'd earned in the avalanche of '53. He stacked tinder by feel, dry moss, shaved bark, curls of spruce. Set it in a triangle over pine twigs, then reached for his flint. 1 strike, no spark. 2. Still nothing. His breath steamed. The metal was too cold. He tucked the flint into his armpit and waited, fingers numb, lips dry. He sat on the edge of the bed platform and stared at the hearth like it owed him something. That was the difference between surviving the first storm and the days after. The first days were adrenaline, movement, tension. But by day 5, the silence became a weight. The air turned thick with memory, and the body stopped complaining, it just began to give. When the flint finally sparked, it hit like a pistol shot. The tinder caught, barely. He cupped his hand, coaxing it with breath. The flame wavered, fought, then bloomed a tiny thing, but alive. He fed it thin slivers, then thumb-sized sticks, then a wedge of oak from the pile near the wall. The fire climbed slow, unsure of itself. But it grew, and Elijah sat there, staring into it like it was an old friend come back from the dead. He hadn't run out of wood yet, but he was close. 1 more week maybe, if he rationed. If the storm let up. If the roof didn't cave and crush his fuel like it had everything else. He carved the 5th mark into the beam. Straight, sharp. No hesitation. Then he did something he rarely did. He opened his mouth and spoke aloud to the fire. "You're not gonna leave." "Me again." The flame cracked once, as if in reply. And outside, somewhere beneath 6 feet of snow, the mountain listened. By day 6, the storm had exhausted itself. It didn't end with a bang, just a long, fading exhale that left the world too quiet to trust. Elijah knew better than to believe it was over. Storms like this didn't leave. They settled. And when snow settles, it crushes. The real threat was beginning now. Inside the cabin, the air had warmed slightly, but the weight pressing down from above had doubled. The log beams in the ceiling made no sound, but they were bending. Not by much, not yet. But he could feel it in the floorboards, in the way his mug rolled ever so slightly toward the hearth when he set it down. He took a stick of charcoal from the mantel and drew a thin horizontal line on the west wall, right beneath the rafters. If the snow weight increased, the beam would sag. And if that line shifted even half an inch, he'd know collapse was starting. He checked the line every hour. At midday, it dipped. Just a hair. Just enough to prove what he already knew. Elijah took action. He braced the ceiling with 2 split logs he'd saved from the roof project. Wedges went under them, one beneath the central beam, one beneath the rafter over the bunk. He drove them in with slow, deliberate taps of his axe butt, listening for groans, cracks, or resistance. The cabin answered with silence. That meant it accepted the help. For now. Afterward, he paced the perimeter of the room, feeling each wall like checking an old friend for wounds. The eastern wall was starting to sweat. Ice melt. The drift outside was thickest there. It was insulating him, yes, but it was also pushing inward. He lit a pine chip, held it near the chink seam, and watched for movement. Nothing. Then he scratched the 6th notch into the doorframe. 6 days. 6 days under snow, under silence, under the memory of what once passed for a town. He ate a slice of smoked fish, dry and cracked like paper. Drank melted snow. Sat by the fire and watched the flames pull shadows up the beams, like ghosts climbing toward the attic. He thought of the other men, if any had lasted this long. He thought of Clive, the loudmouth trader who had mocked his sloped roof and bracing pins. He thought of Mary, buried back east, and how she used to sing without realizing it when she cooked low, wordless hums that sounded like wind through grass. And then he thought of nothing. Just silence. Until the roof creaked. Once. Then stopped. He looked up at the charcoal line. Still there. Still holding. He closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but just to remember the color of daylight. Elijah had been sleeping in fits short, shivering stretches between fire checks and wall taps. But sometime past midnight on the 7th night, something pulled him fully awake. Not a noise. Not exactly. A shift. The kind you don't hear with your ears but feel in your gut. He sat up slowly. The fire was low, just red coals breathing under ash. The cabin was silent. The charcoal line on the wall was intact. The bracing logs still stood where he'd wedged them. But something had changed. He reached for his boots, stiff with frozen sweat, and pulled them on. His coat followed, then his hat. He grabbed the old flintlock from above the doorframe, not loaded, but it made him feel less alone. Then he stood in the center of the room and listened. Still nothing, until he heard it. Movement. Outside. Something brushing against the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be snow falling, too soft to be a bear. A shuffle, then silence, then again a drag. Elijah stepped to the far wall and leaned close. Just a breath away from the timber, he didn't blink. It came again. Scrape, slide, pause. Whatever it wasn't panicked. It was searching, feeling. He thought of the men buried in their cabins, the ones who hadn't braced their roofs. Could something die, have survived out there? Crawled out? Gone mad? His hand tightened on the rifle. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no scratching, just the air holding its breath. He waited an hour, barely moving, heart hammering like he was back in the wilderness of his youth. The cold crept into his bones again, and the silence resumed its reign. At dawn, he cracked open the viewing slit. Nothing, just white. A hard-packed drift where the east wall stood. No tracks, no shadows. But he knew what he'd heard, and he knew better than to dismiss it. The mountain had a way of giving back strange things after a storm hunger in the shape of something human, madness wearing a familiar voice. He didn't speak of it aloud. He just carved the 7th notch deeper than the rest. That morning, he loaded the flintlock for real, set it near the door, double-checked the brace logs, added more wood to the stack, recut the vent slit wider, and dropped a fresh branch into the chimney to check for blockage. Everything held. But Elijah didn't sleep the next night. Not because he was afraid of what might be outside, but because he had a growing suspicion it might want in. By the 8th day, the world was no longer trying to kill him. But it wasn't ready to let him live either. The storm had passed. That much was clear. The air inside the cabin had changed, less pressure, less weight, less of that dead hush that comes when snow is still falling. Now it was just silence, brittle and expectant, like the pause before a question is answered. Elijah cracked open the chimney vent fully and listened. The wind was back, not howling, not violent. Just steady, clean, honest. That was something. Maybe the first honest sound in over a week. He put on his boots, wrapped his coat around his frame like armor, and moved to the roof hatch. Most men didn't build up, but Elijah had. His cabin had a second exit, a vertical tunnel dug upward into a reinforced attic crawl space. During normal winters, it was just storage. But in winters like this one, it was a ladder to the surface. He pried the hatch open slowly. It resisted. Snow had iced over the top, but he'd oiled the hinges. After 5 hard pushes and 1 deep grunt, the seal broke. A shaft of pale light poured down into the cabin, not sunlight, exactly, but sky. Gray, flat, but open. He climbed up and peeked out. The valley was unrecognizable. What had once been a line of cabins, tents, and lean-tos was now a field of white scars. The snow had settled into soft waves over buried structures. Only a few dark patches broke the surface: chimney stones, bent iron stovepipes, the jagged corner of a collapsed roof beam. No smoke, no footprints, just the marks of defeat. He counted 14 cabins, maybe more. None of them stood, except his. He pulled back, shut the hatch, and descended the ladder. The wind whistled now, through the vent, through the cracks in his beard. Through his memory, he sat by the fire and stirred a weak stew of snow, salt, and the last of his jerky. It wasn't food, it was time. As he ate, he carved the 8th notch, clean, precise, almost gentle. He thought of the voices he hadn't heard in days, of the jokes they used to make about his slope angles and crossbeams, of the man who insisted a real roof's flat, it shows strength. He wondered if any of them had made it to the trees, to the river, to anything that wasn't buried. Maybe, but likely not. The mountain had chosen, and Elijah had listened. That night he opened the hatch once more. Just a crack. Let the cold in, let the silence out, and whispered one word into the wind. Sorry. Elijah waited 2 more days before digging out, not because he was afraid, but because he owed the mountain his respect. You never walk too soon after a storm like that. The drifts could look solid and still be hollow. The ground might look steady and give out beneath your boots. Death didn't always come fast. Sometimes it came softly, with a creak underfoot. But on the 10th morning he lit his fire, drank the last of his pine broth, and gathered his tools: an axe, a spade, a coil of rope, and 1 square of smoked venison wrapped in cloth. He opened the roof hatch again. This time the light was brighter, still gray, still dull. But it didn't feel like death anymore. It felt like aftermath. He climbed out. The snow reached his chest. But it was solid now, dense, crusted, packed tight. Good for walking, good for work. He strapped on the snowshoes he'd carved 2 winters ago and moved toward the valley's heart. Each cabin was worse than he imagined. Some had caved in completely, the roofs collapsed inward like broken chests. Others were split down the middle, their walls shoved outward by the weight of the sky. A few were simply missing, swallowed whole. Nothing remained but a lump in the snow and the faint smell of smoke beneath. He reached Clive's place first. The stovepipe was, bent sideways, frozen in a scream. He dug until he found a boot, then a hand. He stopped digging. Clive didn't need rescuing anymore. He marked the spot with 3 crossed branches and kept moving. One by one, he visited the others. The boy from Arkansas who'd built too close to the tree line, the older couple who'd tried to live on flat ground, no elevation, the loud crew of miners who said tents were good enough as long as you had whiskey. None had survived. Each time, Elijah stopped, dug just enough to know, then moved on. By dusk, he had found 8. 8 cabins, 8 men, 8 mistakes written in snow. He made a circle of branches near the center of the valley, not a grave, just a signpost, something that said they were here. Something for the spring thaw to find. Then he stood in the silence. Not the kind from before, not the crushing silence of snow on your roof. This was different, lighter, almost sad. The mountain had made its judgment, and Elijah had walked among the verdicts. When he returned to his cabin, the fire had gone low. He stirred the embers, added a log, and sat beside the warmth. Then he carved the 9th notch, and this time, when he looked at it, he cried, quietly, without ceremony. For the men who'd laughed, for the men who'd rushed, for the ones who hadn't built for the storm that was coming, and for the burden of being the last one to learn why. By the 11th day, the sky turned blue again. Not bright, not cheerful, just clear. A cold, clean blue that stretched over the valley like a bandage. The storm was gone. The mountain had gone quiet. Not the silence of dread anymore, the silence of grief. Elijah opened the hatch and stood in the morning light, leaning on his shovel, eyes narrowed against the brightness. The wind was gone. The snow had settled. The worst was over. But the valley was still a graveyard. He walked the ridge line again, this time not to dig, just to remember. Each buried cabin told a story now, marked by a scrap of canvas, a bent nail in the snow, or a half-buried axe frozen mid-fall. Every one a lesson, every one a name he'd spoken aloud that week, even if just once. He added new branches to the circle he'd built. Then he returned to his own cabin, the one with the sloped roof no one believed in, the one they mocked as overbuilt, the one he'd made too strong on purpose. It was the only thing left standing. He sat near the hearth and carved the final mark into the door frame, the 10th notch, straight, deep, clean. Then he did something strange. He took his knife and carved a new mark beneath the others, not a notch, but a name, E. Braddock. Just that. Because if anyone came after, and the spring sun ever melted the snow enough to find his cabin, they'd know it hadn't survived by accident. It had survived because someone built it for the storm that was coming. Not the storm people feared, the one they dismissed, the one that laughed at, walls, and crushed roofs like kindling, the one that taught silence by burying sound. He sat there until the fire burned low. Then he stepped outside, boots sinking into snow still waist-high, and looked back at the structure that had held. The cabin wasn't proud, it wasn't beautiful, but it remembered, it held the heat, held the weight, held the name of the man who believed in building for the worst, not the best. That spring, others would come. Young men with fresh tools and old maps, traders and trappers looking for opportunity. And when they saw the ruins scattered across the valley, they'd see one cabin untouched. They'd ask who built it, who lived, why it lasted. And maybe, if they were wise, they'd listen. Because the truth was in the wood, in the sloped roof, in the braces, in the hatch no one else thought to build. In the marks on the wall, 10 notches and a name. Elijah Braddock didn't survive because he was lucky. He survived because he planned to. And long after he was gone, the cabin would still be there, standing quiet in the snow, whispering to anyone willing to listen. Build for what's coming, not what's comfortable. And if they listened, they might survive the next storm too.